Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second of a double bill today. If you didn't catch the earlier show with Tony talking about the Battle of Bataan in 1942, it was an absolute classic, fantastic stuff. But anyway, we're at a different subject now, and there was a lot of emphasis on the landing vessels at the smaller end of the scale, the Higgins boat, the LCA, if you're British, the LVT. But for my money, it is the LST that won the war in terms of getting stuff to the invasion sites. Alex Beeman is here to tell us more. I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, Alex. How are you today?
Hello, Paul. Morning. Wait, it's afternoon for me.
Just afternoon. Morning for those in California. Was it still? I don't know. Whatever. Anyway, you're here.
Yeah,
so tell us about your particular interest and connection with LSTs before we begin the presentation.
Yeah, I'm an attorney actually in Southern Indiana. And I moved down to Evansville, Indiana a couple of years ago. And in Evansville, which you'll show you in the presentation, we have one of the surviving World War II LSTs, LST 325. And so I started more recently volunteering and giving tours on that. And that kind of sparked an interest, particularly in the landing ship tanks itself. But my grandfather was in Pearl Harbor, actually, or survivor of Pearl Harbor. And my paternal grandfather was in the occupation army in Japan. So I've kind of always had a keen interest in Second World War stuff.
Brilliant. Well, we've got a PowerPoint that you're going to take us through. So, folks, we'll do any kind of big questions about, shipping policies and at the end of the show if there's time. But if there's specific questions about the details Alex is sharing, obviously far away. But I think having seen the slides in advance, most of your questions, most of the stuff will be covered as we go along. I'll hand over to my guest. So here we are, the landing ship tank.
Thanks, Paul. So the cover here has a picture on here that I'm probably most of you are very, very familiar with. I toned down the transparency so it's not as bright as usual. But I show this picture on the tour that I give, which I'll talk about in later on in the presentation. But one thing that people don't realize that are surprised about is that the big ships there on the foreground of that picture, those are actually LSTs. People unfamiliar with World War II don't understand that those are LSTs. They kind of think that there's some other type of assault vessel. So one of the interesting things I think in educating people about this is that how important I think the ship is. Yeah. One of the things I'm going to try to explain to you in this presentation is how important of a ship it is, and then we can debate kind of the nuances of importance. This is not meant to be a thorough treatise on the development of that. Other people, Max Friedman, one guy, done significant books on this topic. But I do want to give a little brief background. The need for landing ship tanks came about because the British got expelled from Northwest Europe. At some point in time, it was going to be necessary to land heavy equipment and tanks on foreign beaches, wherever that may be. The need arose, obviously, then to develop something that would be able to accomplish that. And the theory behind it is you want to be able to quickly, provide tanks, heavy equipment, artillery supplies faster than the other side can reinforce their stuff. Particularly when you don't have ports and docks. So we'll talk about that as kind of one of the conditions about when LSTs are kind of important and when they're not important. But that's kind of the need arose at that point in time. The first attempt in making an LST actually came from the British, and which is maybe most of the listeners today. It came from the British, and actually they were just requisitioned oil tankers from Venezuela, actually. So they were just slightly modified. You can see a picture of one of them right there. That's the Becario, the last one, HMS Becario. They were long oil tankers used in Venezuela. And they basically just modified them by adding a huge ramp to them, cut off the front a little bit, and used them like that. Pretty simple concept. Pretty actually good idea. The next kind of attempt was on the next slide. Actually, this is HMS Thruster. This was what they called the Atlantic Tank Landing Craft, ATLC. Sometimes it'll be referenced as. But basically, I referenced this here on the bottom of this slide too. Basically, those were another really long tanker that they basically just modified to add tanks inside of it. Now, the development of the Becario and the first three and the Boxer, Bruiser, and Thruster, the issue was those came about basically at the same time. So they didn't really actually learn anything off of doing the Becario experiment before they actually produced the Boxers. And the ultimate problem really came down to they didn't get it shallow enough. Didn't have a shallow enough draft. And the draft is the distance basically between the very bottom of the boat or ship to the water line. So the issue became, hey, we need to figure out a better way to do this. How the Boxer and Bruiser and Thruster accomplished getting stuff from the ship all the way to the beach was actually just a really long ramp. The problem was with that ramp, on top of the fact that they were taking up too much water, was that it was a huge ramp. It was a 140-foot ramp. And so therefore it also took a lot of space up. And so you lost a lot of cargo hold space in the ship. So the real next attempt was, hey, the British and the Americans sat down in November of 1941. A delegate of Brits came over the United States. They met, they discussed, hey, we need to develop a ship. At that point in time, it was discussed in two things. The Americans were going to build them, and the Americans were going to design a landing ship tank. The design of this came about very, very quick. You can actually see the picture there on the right side of the screen is actually the original sketch that John Niedermeyer, who was the guy that is the designer of it, sketched out. And that was actually done in November of 1941. The final design came about in January of 1942. So again, remember, Pearl Harbor, Americans' involvement in the war actually didn't even start when this thing first actually came about. The whole entire concept was we were going to lend-lease these to the British to use. The guidelines now for this design is outlined there. I mentioned on the top is one very important ocean-going vessel. We're coming from England. We're coming from America. Eventually we'll be coming from America, carrying large vessels. It has to be ocean-going. On the other hand, it's got to be able to conduct beaching operations. So in the design of all these, there's always this give and take of, hey, we need deeper draft because deeper draft's way better for sea-going vessels. But you also don't want it too deep because then you won't be able to easily conduct beaching operations. There were some parameters on speed. There was a parameter, the fact that it would need to hold tanks, obviously. But really the big thing was, hey, how much draft can we get away with and that sort of thing. The final design there ended, it blew up from that picture that you see in the right side of the screen there. It blew up in two ways. It was basically lengthened and it was basically widened a little bit. And that actually allowed it to be a little bit lower draft, and it also increased actually the capacity of it. Just an aside, John Niedermeyer actually was already a pretty popular, well-known marine architect before this. And so he had designed hundreds and hundreds of ships. He actually ended up working for the Bureau of Ships and designing stuff all the way through the 50s. And during his tenure, they designed, and now obviously all of them never obviously got built, but they designed around 8,000 ships during his tenure, actually, of different types of Navy vessels. So that's why people have referred to him as kind of the father of modern Navy shipping. The final result is actually the LST, right? So that's what we actually now call the landing ship tank. It's just an acronym for landing ship tank. A lot of people are confused. They always ask because we have a museum when we do the tours, which I'm going to talk about in a second, but they were like, what's LST stand for? And it's just an acronym for landing ship tank. Yeah. The picture here, actually, I do want to talk about briefly. So this is a picture. It's actually the reason why I took a picture of it. During World War II, you don't get a lot of good overview shots of some of these ships. There's not a whole ton of good ones on LSTs really, that kind of show the entire thing. This is a model we actually have in the museum that kind of shows a good description of it. This is LST 325. The museum's obviously LST 325. LST 326 was a British one. So it was one of the LSTs that the Americans made and then gave it immediately to the British. So it's an HM LST 326. This actual model itself, interestingly enough, was gifted by the family of the captain of the LST 326. His name was Leonard Pitcher. He was from Kent, England, actually. And right immediately before he was the captain of that boat, he was actually captain of a Flower class corvette called the HMS Hibiscus, actually. So kind of an interesting relationship there. And to show you more of an actual picture of an LST, this is the 388. This is a picture from Utah Beach, I believe, later in June. And this is a high and dry. We'll talk about how it kind of works in a little bit later. But this is a high and dry exercise where they're unloading on low tide, basically. But that gives you an idea of just how flat the boat is, just how really very flat it is, and kind of the profile of kind of what it looks like. And we'll talk about some nuances and stuff like that. Now, I want to talk about briefly LS 325. And we're going to get into how these were built and that sort of thing right now. This presentation, by the way, is not in my capacity as a member of the LST Memorial Group or anything. This is just me and myself and I. But I would implore you, if you have the time, go to lstmemorial.org. The website's there on the bottom of the screen. There's a shop in there. There's information about the LST. You can kind of see what it looks like. There's some good videos and that sort of thing that I've been unable to incorporate into the presentation that show a really good view of it. The LST 325 is actually the last remaining World War II configured LST that actually still sails. In fact, in the United States, aside from a couple Liberty ships, it's actually the only World War II vessel that actually still sails. Every year, the organization takes the LST 325 either up Mississippi River or the Ohio River and does cruises and goes and visits different locations where people can then tour. This year, it went all the way to Pittsburgh and back. Some 35,000 tickets got sold this year alone to come on do the tour and walk through. And fortunately for you guys, now we have Zoom and all this other good features and internet.
Slight internet drop out there. Hopefully it's back now.
Oh, can you hear me?
Just
Can you hear me, Paul?
we're just having right.
Hey, Paul, can you hear me? Paul, can you hear me? Oh, okay. He says he just has issues. All right, we'll keep going. So the organization does a great job. They go on cruises and they'll take tours of stuff. That's how I actually got into that's how I actually specifically got into it. The LST 325, we'll talk about it here in a second, was built actually in Philadelphia. And the reason why it exists now is that it was actually given after the World War II. And you can ask questions about this later. It's actually given after the war eventually to the Greek Navy. And the Greek Navy operated all the way up till 1999. And then shortly thereafter, the organization basically was able to take it over, bring it back across the Atlantic Ocean. and set it up in a museum in Evansville, Indiana. The reason why it exists actually in Evansville, Indiana, is that Evansville was the location of where more LSTs were built than any other shipyard. The presentation might be a little fact heavy here at the very beginning with some of these numbers, but essentially the ships were built at a number of yards, and you can see the number there. And now the number's it's a little bit debatable, but my number that I use in my spreadsheet that I have is 1,054 of these were built. It's a lot of ships. It's a lot of LSTs. Now, they were done over 17 different shipyards. Now, there's 19 emergency shipyards that they were done in. And 19 emergency shipyards, what I mean by that is those are shipyards that basically just came out of the blue. They just basically, hey, we got a contract. We need to build a shipyard right away. And so if you look at the companies there on the side, you'll notice some of the companies. In Evansville was the Missouri Valley Bridge Company. In Seneca, Illinois, it was the Chicago Bridge and Iron Company. The companies that got this, or a lot of them were just companies that had a good relationship with steel producers, basically. And they got the wartime contract, and then they had to find out a place to do it. Evansville ended up being a good place to do it. Jeffersonville, Indiana, just down the Ohio River, they already had a shipyard going on, so those were not one of the emergency ones. And then the Navy was able to obviously build a few of these too. However, if you go ahead and look at the Navy, just look at the lines with the Navy ones on there, Boston Navy Yard and Charleston and Philadelphia. Notice how few they actually ended up making in comparison to some of those other yards. And the real reason is because first, the demand was too much. They wanted to build way too many of these LSTs, and these big Navy shipyards couldn't do it. They were also, by the way, building large capital ships. So, for instance, the LST-325 was built in Philadelphia. That's the same place where they built the USS Wisconsin and the USS New Jersey, both Iowa-class battleships. That took forever to build, right? So they were able to accomplish a little bit there. But the other good part about the concept is that you're building an LST. It has a very low draft. You do not need a deep harbor to build these in. And so that's largely why they went inland. The other good part about going inland is obviously if you're on a large river, you can still have the ability to float steel and coal and all the different inputs that are needed basically to build the ships. That's why basically most of the ships at 670 were built just on the 5 what they call the cornfield shipyards, which are basically just the shipyards in the center of the United States, Evansville, Illinois, Pittsburgh, and Jeffersonville. So the first one built there was October 1942. So again, literally less than a year, the first one was actually delivered. And that's actually the deliver date. That's not even just laying the keel down. That's actually delivering the actual LST.
Right. We had a quick question for you, and sorry, apologies, my internet disappeared earlier.
Oh, it's okay.
Trevor asked, who were the design authority and in charge of configuration control and design changes over so many yards?
Yep. So it was actually the Bureau of the Navy oversaw all of the yards, even though they were private organizations. The Bureau of the Navy was in charge. So Navy presence was there at every single one of them. I'll show you a picture I'll actually show you a picture right now. Actually, just keep it easy. This is the Evansville shipyard. Kind of gives you a nice sense of kind of what it looked like. And also, here's kind of a good overview. This is actually from a Cub reconnaissance plane that was taken. If you go on the far right side, you can kind of see where the slipway was, right? Where it comes from the land and kind of slides into the water there. How it worked in Evansville and quite a the other emergency ones, particularly, is they would float them first. They would lay the keel, design it, float them, and then kind of an assembly line, basically. The further down on this picture, the further west you get, the more complete it is. There's a bunch of different piers there, and then basically all the welders and stuff like that, they will come on and slowly. And so by the time you get the LST at the very bottom here, it's ready to go. And that's where the Navy guys pick it up, basically. So if you actually go back, I forgot I didn't include that one. The shipyard was a 24/7 operation. From everything I've read, all the other ones were 24/7 operations. that was also, besides the Bureau of Navy overseeing it, the Coast Guard actually was in charge of security. So the Coast Guard were monitoring with some cutters actually in the river, and you literally couldn't go through this part of the Ohio River unless you had proper paperwork, and you stopped to check with the Coast Guard actually. So it's highly secretive program. Now LSTs don't, interestingly enough, get names right at this time. Later, after the war, they started to take on the name of counties of the United States. So there was one called the Vanderburgh County, which is where Evansville is at, for instance, Johnson County, Hillary County, they just name them after counties. We have a tendency in America, if you've noticed, the battleships and large capital ships are named after states. And then if you go the step below, that would be cruisers, and the cruisers are named after big cities. So like Chicago or Toledo or something like that. So they went out with the step below that, which is the counties, basically, eventually to name them. But at this time, they didn't actually name them. They just gave them a number. So everyone knew their number of LST. That said, they were treated just like any other large ship. Here's LST, the launching of LST 128 in Evansville. The Secretary of Treasury, Morgenthau, actually is visiting that day, actually, and you can do the launching there. But it's christened by them, champagne bottle and everything. And then it's commissioned just like any other ship. There's a whole commissioning ceremony and everything. Now, one of the interesting things is all the Navy guys, and there's hundreds of books and memoirs and stuff written by LST guys. One of the unique aspects of it is you actually just go and pick it up wherever it's at most of the time. Later on in the war, they ended up having specific crews that would take them to larger ports, like they would take them from Evansville down to New Orleans, or they would take them from like Philadelphia down to Newport News. But most of the time, they would actually go pick up the ship at the actual shipyard. And so there's some interesting stories. I mean, there's some guys that literally got on the ship at the shipyard away from home and never got off the ship until the end of the war, basically, which is kind of an interesting experience. And a lot of those things, which we can talk about a little bit later, a lot of the LSTs ended up seeing action in both theaters, both ETO and Pacific. Now, for most of our viewers here, again, I mentioned the Lend-Lease, right? A lot of the ships were originally destined and designed to be given over to the British or the Royal Hellenic Navy, the Greeks. And the number varies, and it's a hard number to reach because some of the LSTs were built specifically, and they knew where they were going to be given to the Royal Navy. Other ones were only given to the Royal Navy after North Africa and after Sicily. And so the number's kind of a moving target, but I try to approximate about 115 were eventually turned over to the Royal Navy. Another interesting aspect, mostly in the Pacific, was that quite a few of the LSTs were manned by United States Coast Guard as well. Which is, you see it in Operation Neptune, at least with respect to some of the smaller landing craft. In the Pacific, a lot of the LSTs ended up being Coast Guard manned. Now, the flag there, you'll see, interestingly enough, the flag, that's actually in our museum, the Union Jack flag there. I don't know if do you guys call it a Union Jack? We call it a Union Jack in the States.
Yeah, there's a kind of a myth that it should only be a Union Jack if it's over a ship and a Union flag if it's on land, but it is the Union Jack. So yeah, it's
okay. Well, so this is a Union Jack that was once a Union Jack over LST 157 actually, and so the LST 157 was actually the very first LST that came out of the Evansville shipyard, and actually it became a British LST. And so this is actually a flag that got donated. I think it's one of the cool exhibits we have. Flag we got donated in front of that one LST that was another British LST that's actually in the museum, which is pretty cool, I think.
Just a quick question for you, Alex, because when you were talking about the design of the LST and talking about the collaboration between the Americans and the British, Larry Ferrero, who we had on the channel about a year ago in his book Churchill's Arsenal, was talking about that LST as one of his examples of the best of the British American whatever you want to call it, collaboration, consultation. Yep. It's an example of Lend-Lease isn't just stuff going across the Atlantic from west to east. It's about sharing of ideas, sharing of initiatives. And would you agree that the LST is a product of that relationship?
Absolutely. While the design in the building was given up pretty much for Americans' discretion, everything was checked with the British to say that was okay. And in fact, once the final designs were done, they actually flew the designs over to the British for the final checkoff.
Yeah, thank you.
So absolutely. Now we're gonna get into the kind of the tour part of the thing. I'm not gonna talk a lot about operations, specific operations, and there's books on different operations like Husky and all that stuff. And I talk about that on my tour a little bit. But the one thing that you guys have a hard time seeing, at least when you're not in America and you can't visit Evansville, is actually see what the ship looks like. So I'm going to try to do a little bit of a tour, kind of a tour guide thing here today, and kind of to give you a sense of what it looks like. And so we're going to kind of look at the wheelhouse. We're going to go look at the tank deck, which is cool. And we're going to talk about some of the really unique aspects of this ship, stuff you really don't see in a lot of other stuff. And some of the other stuff I'm going to glare over because it's kind of normal that you see in most ships. So here's the wheelhouse. We're going to first take a look at the wheelhouse. I compare, there's a picture of an older one, an LST 170 there. But you can see the wheelhouse. We have it. This is a picture I took last week, Paul. So all these pictures are actually brand new that I just snapped when I was there last week. This is our LST wheelhouse is in pretty much World War II complete big configuration. You can't see through on the other side of the helm now. There's actually a real throttle. At this time, the LSTs, they just had the annunciator, so the engine order telegraph there in the front, the gold thing there in the front. So they actually controlled the throttle from down in the engine room, which I'll show you some pictures of here a little bit later. But otherwise, you can see a gyroscope there right above the engine order telegraph. You can see the red and green ball, which is there's a binocle compass there, and those are Kelvin balls to help adjust for the magnetic fields. And then basically there's a tube that goes up right above the deck there. And then that's where actually the officer on the deck was. So the helmsman would be behind the wheel here. And then the actual officer on the deck, whether that was the first lieutenant or otherwise, would be usually stationed one level above you. And they would bark down orders, either yelling or through a tube. Now, I just mentioned the engine room. One of the things you cannot see on the tour, this is a fully operational ship. And so by regulation, it has to be a guided tour, actually. One of the other places we really can't take you is the engine room because there's too much dangerous stuff, basically. Fortunately, I was able to go down there, obviously, and snap photos and that sort of thing. That's one of the engines, actually. There on the left side is one of the engines. On the right side was actually originally where the engine order telegraph would have been, and that's where they would have actually adjusted it. This is one of the modifications, obviously, for modern use. This is a computer, right? And it has all the information that we need on it. And it has, you can see the modern throttle there on the right side for both port and starboard side. It's kind of a thing, but basically the engine is a diesel engine. It's a 900 horsepower. It's a V12. Actually, all they are is actually locomotive engines. And basically bolted to the ground and then directly put into, the propeller shaft. So pretty simple move and nothing naval specific to it whatsoever. The original engines are actually still in the LST. These are actually the original ones that were put in there in 1942. So they're still kicking. As long as you keep a diesel engine going, it'll run for a long, long, long time. Now, back up to where we were. Back up to where we were in the wheelhouse. Right behind the wheelhouse is a chart room, which you can see is on the right side there. We have some more modern stuff there now. And then right behind that is actually the radio room. So that's where the radio room and the chart room were for the maps and that sort of thing on the thing. One of the interesting aspects of the LST, this is a unique feature of a ship. It has an elevator on it. So if you look at the right side, this is LST 325 when it's headed towards Sicily. That's actually the Boise in there that's shelling the land in Sicily. And basically LST 325 slides behind it there in a second to go to land. But just look at how much stuff is on top of the tank deck. The top deck's we call it the main deck, or it's called a weather deck in nautical terms oftentimes. But just look how much stuff, look how many Jeeps, how many different half-ton Dodges there are. It's just stuffed. Well, how do you get that stuff up there? Well, you actually, on the LST 325, you actually used an elevator. So you can see the picture on the left or on the bottom side. There's a tarp over it right now for winterization purposes, but you can kind of see the yellow little circular things. Those are hooked to a winch, which is showing on the top picture. And that winch basically just winches it up and down. And you basically just load each vehicle, lower it down, and it goes to the tank deck, and then you take it out you take it out the bow of the ship on the ramp. We'll get to some of the modifications, but one of the modifications in the later LSTs was they got rid of this. They ended up actually just having like they called it a tweener deck or a ramp that would flip down, and you would just drive down it. That ended up being a much better design. I think the concept was maybe the elevator was going to save some space initially. The problem is it was too slow. So it's a good 3 or 4 minutes up and down. And you have 50 different items on there that you got to get off the top deck. Okay, that's going to take you 2 hours, right? It's just not economically time-wise to use. Eventually, they kind of quickly realized that. But kind of a unique feature. And I'll show you where that comes out actually in the tank deck in a second. Now, obviously, you guys saw the bow doors. You're familiar with how the bow doors work and some of the other pictures. The bow doors are controlled from a spot there on the port side. For those not nautically inclined, port means left side. On the very front left side of the ship, basically, is the bow door control room, which you're viewing right here. So on the right side there, you can actually see some red little toggler buttons. That's actually where the ones on the left, the two on the left are actually the doors. And then the ramp is the third one on the right. That's actually how you get the ramp up and down. And basically those bow doors just clamshell open like this, and then the ramp comes down. Now it's a little more complicated to that because it's all tied up and that sort of thing, and it takes quite a while to get it all untied and all undone before you do it. But that's once you get it untied, it's fairly simple. Now what the person that was on the bow door control room could see is actually this window on the left here. If you look at the picture on the left and you look down, you're looking actually down the tank deck. So that's actually the view that the operator would have of looking in the tank deck. Now, the one on the right is I have now stepped down into the tank deck, and I'm on the tank deck. I'm actually kind of just in front of basically the bow doors, and I'm looking back towards the stern of the ship, the back of the ship. So that kind of gives you an idea kind of what the inside of the tank deck looked like. Now, we have a museum set up in there somewhat. We're working on some exhibits there on the right side. You see the white stuff on the white side. We have some exhibits down near the back too, and some that sort of stuff. So, but if you look at pictures when there's an empty tank deck, it's pretty empty. They'll have storage stuff on the sides in the pictures, but otherwise they kept it pretty empty for vehicles. Now, here's on the far right picture is basically me turning around and taking a picture of where I was previously. That's the bow door. In the summer, we have it opened up and everything like that. I took these pictures a couple weeks ago and it was like 20 degrees. So we had it closed for that reason. But that's me turning around, taking a picture, looking back. That's what it looks like exiting it. If you look up, you'll see the red light. Right above the red light, there's 3 little black things, and you can see the red, yellow, and green. That's actually just a traffic light. One of the things they learned pretty quickly was it's really, really loud in the tank deck. It's super loud in the tank deck. If I'm giving a tour and it's closed like it is right there, I yell, and you can almost hear yourself echoing all the way through it. It's really, really loud. So as you can imagine, look at the picture from that one up there. That's one of the training videos, just how loud that would have been. It would have been insanely loud. Well, they realized that. And so what they ended up doing was they ended up adding traffic lights. And so basically greens means go. And they basically had a red stop, don't do anything, yellow get ready, green means go. And then that's how they signaled, because you couldn't hear anything even though you had headsets and stuff on. Now, me go back real fast. So on the tank deck, if you look actually on the picture on the right side there, on the very bottom floor of that, it's kind of gray paint. On behind there's actually space still, and the space on those sides are different shops and storage areas. And so the shops they have are kind of there on the left side. They have the electric shop, battery shop, machine shop. There's a laundry actually in the far back left now. And on the far right picture here, that's actually the fire damage control room, which is kind of up the stairs a little bit. But that's all down there on the tank deck, pretty close to the tank deck level, just adjacent to it. Now, interestingly enough, one of the other things besides noise that they didn't have the forethought really to think too hard through was the ventilation. So one of the modifications that they made was the ventilation. You have a bunch of tanks in there and you're running a bunch of diesel tanks. There's going to be a lot of carbon dioxide. So again, besides noise, it's really gassy basically in there. And they had to figure out a way to basically allow you to warm up your tanks, warm up whatever vehicle you're doing, because you can't just turn on you don't want to be landing, turning on your tank and then trying to go. That's just, you're setting yourself up for failure basically if you don't warm up your diesel tank. So they installed a bunch of ventilation fans, and then there was additional vents that they could open up that were on the top deck at the time. You could just open them up, and that allowed those gases kind of to escape. If you look at the left video there, or the left picture there, there's a circular thing there, and there's a black thing in the middle. That's an electric fan, and all the vents would be powered through the electric fan. The fan controls you saw in a picture that were beside the bow door control already, but you can kind of see a picture that I found of one on the top right there. He's kind of pushing the button to turn on the electrical fans. There was also carbon monoxide detectors actually at the time that they actually used to make sure it didn't get too crazy. How good they were, I don't know. What level they were set at, I don't know. But they did actually have some sort of detector. Interestingly enough, the development of the ventilation fans was actually done in Fort Knox. So this is what they call the Fort Knox LST on the bottom right. It's actually in Fort Knox, Kentucky. Fort Knox, Kentucky. It's about 2.5 hours east of where I'm at right now. It's where the General Patton Museum is, if you've ever had a chance to go visit that. It's also where the United States Gold Reserve is at, which is more popularly known for, at least in the movies. They actually built a replica LST tank deck out of wood, and this is where they actually developed the ventilation system initially. And then once they developed the ventilation system there, Fort Knox actually acted as a training facility. And so they'd actually just practice how we unload and get off of an LST using this building. The building is still there. It's storage for stuff now, for old vehicles and stuff now, but it's actually still there, and you can actually still go visit it to this day. All right. One of the other interesting aspects that an LST had was ballast tanks. They were super, super critical to an LST. You'll see on the right side there, that's actually one of the ballast pumps. They're on the very bottom floor. The very bottom picture you'll see here actually shows, if you look closely, you'll actually be able to see where it says ballast tank. And so on the very bottom of the ship, they had ballast tanks basically along both port and starboard sides. And then they had some centralized ones too. And they actually had some floating ones, meaning you could actually either put diesel fuel in it if you wanted to, or you could use it for a ballast, basically. And so the ballast tanks would be used in a lot of different respects. One was when you're ocean going, you want to have a deeper draft. So basically you would flood the ballast tanks to make a deeper draft. When you're doing a beaching operations, for instance, you might flood the back ballast tanks to be able to flip up the front more than usual. One of the really unique aspects of it was you could actually, LSTs oftentimes carried an LCT, particularly when they went over across from the States on a convoy. They usually carried an LCT on top of them. The top left picture is actually an LST tipping. They called it launching. launching an LCT. So an LCT is about 150 foot long. They would actually put LCTs on top of the LSTs, and they would actually use the ballast. They would ballast up one side, ballast down the other, and you would actually be able to get it to tip, and the LCTs would just fall off on a grease rail into the water. Kind of a unique way to launch a ship when you didn't have a huge, heavy crane to be able to unload it.
Alex, we're getting questions in the sidebar about its kind of performance at sea, so to speak, and how is that something you're going to be addressing later on, or do you want to do a couple of
I can talk about it right now. Short of it is not good.
The questions we're getting, just so that you know where we're going with this, is Jay White said it must have been a rough transatlantic ride. David K said probably will come to this. Did LST suffer any of the brittle steel problems like the Liberty ships? And Samuel said, were the LSTs built using mostly riveting or welding? Riveting or welding? If welded, did they have the same problems with integrity? And so general questions about, you know, getting them across the Atlantic, long distances, their kind of, you know, floatiness, for want of a better term. That's not a naval term at all, but it's the one that came into my head.
Yeah. There's actually a good book, LST 388. He talks about the Atlantic crossing quite a bit in this one. There's a number of books that talk about it. Let's just say it was not a good ride. It's a flat bottom boat, so it's almost just basic nautical physics, basically, right? It's a flat bottom boat. It does not cut through water like a V-hole. So there's one of the veterans used to have a saying basically that, you know, an LST doesn't go through water, it doesn't go on top of the water, it just bashes right into it.
Yeah.
And basically that's the experience that most of the guys had. In fact, a lot of the stories go, I mean, during the Atlantic crossing, and there's some videos online that you can see how tippy they get. The edge of the top deck will get into the water even. Now it can go about 45 degrees before it actually capsizes, so it can get pretty far over on itself. But they basically didn't eat for a couple weeks, is effectively what happened. I mean, there's stories of guys they basically just eating hot dogs, raw hot dogs, because that's really all they could make. They couldn't actually, you know, boil anything or anything like that for being too dangerous. It was not good. The Atlantic obviously was kind of the worst place to be. You know, the Pacific's a little less intense. The Mediterranean's still a little bit lesser intensity wise. So it's those convoys really is where it was really, really, really bad. Now you also, another thing is in Okinawa, they had that horrible typhoon in the Pacific. And I forget I actually have the date right now somewhere. It was October of 1945, actually, right after the war. They had a horrible typhoon, Typhoon Louise, in Okinawa area. It actually ended up grounding, sinking, destroying somewhere in the neighborhood of like 12 or 15 LSTs, just from that typhoon alone. Yeah, they don't float well. Just thinking it's more like a rubber ducky, I would say, in your bathtub than an actual boat itself. Now, as far as welding and riveting goes, they were welded. And actually, I'm aware of not a single one that actually failed because of welding issues.
Right.
Not saying it didn't happen. Probably did happen. And we're dealing with 1,054 ships, based on my count. But it was not let's just say it was not a routine problem or a routine failure that they saw in some of the Liberty ship issues.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Now, I mentioned back on that picture there, I'll show back. Let me go back to the tank deck real quick. On the tank deck, you see on the right side there, now stepping up one level there, and you can kind of see the stairs there in yellow on the right side. Where the white is, are all along the port and starboard side. That's actually where troop compartment is. So it's a step below the weather deck. So it's right underneath where you store the vehicles on top deck. You come down, you step down, and you're right into troop compartment. And basically, troop compartment and berthing goes all the way on down on both sides. On the port side, which is the picture that I have on the right side here, that was almost entirely berthing all the way down. And the very, very back is where the restrooms were. and showers were. And then on the other side was basically the same thing all the way until you got the back. Now in the back on the other side is actually where they had troop messing, so where they would actually eat. And they had some other berthing spots too, basically. But basically, it's just the width of that short little width there. That's all you had, basically. It theoretically, it had 200 cots. They oftentimes hot racked it, meaning they just shared the cots with somebody else. But again, theoretically, when you're on an LST, you're not supposed to be there all that long. So, you know, you're a short ride, maybe a day or two, right? You're not supposed to be on there for many, many weeks. So the accommodations were not always the greatest, but I guess they were generally, for the most part, pretty short in their nature, for the most part. But to give you an idea, there was almost 550 people on the LST on 325 when it made its first venture from Falmouth over to Normandy during Operation Neptune. And obviously they actually loaded up on the 2nd of June, to give you an idea, and didn't get off until the 7th. So they're actually on there quite a bit longer. Now, one of the good parts about being on an LST, and Ernie Pyle wrote about this, and a couple other, you'll notice people write about this thing, is food. Food tends to be pretty good because you're going port to port. So you're usually able to get some fresh rations and that sort of stuff. And you're less eating out of like a tin can or a K ration or whatever. You're more getting fresh food and breads and that sort of thing while you're in port. You'll see on the left side here, this is LST 698. You can actually see this is actually the tank deck. So they actually they would oftentimes load these suckers up too much to where there would not be enough compartments for troops or sleeping areas. And so they would end up just hanging out in the tank deck and sleeping on tanks and sleeping on vehicles and that sort of thing. The other thing is what you'll see in the Pacific, notably, if you remember going back to the picture of the guy in the wheelhouse who was behind the helm, if you noticed, he didn't have a shirt on. The standards in LSTs were generally a little bit lower, I think, with respect to a lot of that stuff. But in the Pacific, they were really hot. They didn't have air conditioning, right? So they were absolutely just steaming, particularly in the tank deck. They got really, really hot. So a lot of times you'll see pictures of guys actually just spending the night on top deck if they can find a spot, because it's the coolest spot in the area. Now, on the right side is just quickly, that's the troops. I can tell where those, it's an unknown LST of some sort, but the troop where they actually stayed was actually on the very back of the ship, in like the fantail area of the ship. Same level as the troops, just kind of in the very, very back. Now, another unique aspect of a LST is that it has an anchor and a winch. Well, anchor is pretty typical, I guess, of most ships. But it has a winch, and it has a winch for a very unique reason. The winching actually would be used for beaching operations. And so the winch there on the right side would actually let out the anchor, which you can see kind of on the left side there off the back of the ship. It has 900 feet of cable, and you would let it out. You wouldn't let it out all 900 usually be like 600 or whatever, kind of dependent on the geography of the beach itself. But you would actually let the winch go out and anchor go out real early before you hit the beach. And then you would go full bore into the beach, you hit the beach, and you actually maintain full forward during beaching operations. Now, the winch had two basic jobs. The first job was it didn't allow the boat to fishtail or to broach, I think is the nautical term. So it didn't allow it to swing side to side. It kept it perpendicular to the beach. And then the more obviously unique issue is it actually helped you basically reel yourself off the beach after you were done. Kind of like a fishing pole, basically. Kind of a unique experience because, I mean, you're typically not trying to purposely beach a ship. So it's kind of the unique aspect, one of the very, very unique aspects of an LST. Got to briefly mention about guns real fast. Most LSTs came with about 12 20-millimeter Oriclins that were usually tagged to the top deck of the ship, kind of like basically 6 each side. And then most of them initially came with 4 single 40-millimeter Bofors and aircraft cannons. And then they usually had two double ones or twin on the very, very bow of the ship and in the very, very stern of the ship. Now, after the campaign in Italy and Sicily, most of the ones that are in the ETO got modified to the effect that they added usually a 3-inch cannon on the back, at the very, very back of the ship. Was kind of usually added, and then eventually the most of them got Mark 51 directors for a twin. So they were able to use the directors at some point in time too. But that was kind of the initial. Most of them came with this kind of setup, and then they were slightly modified depending on the LST and what its purpose was for, which we'll kind of get to. Now, unfortunately, I took a picture last week, and we have the LST 325 has 2 Higgins boats or LCVPs on it. They're on these davits that are on the side here. You've seen from the pictures there, you can see them floating on the side of the davits. This is a davit. So basically this kind of just swings out like this, and then you lower it down. Pretty simple concept. The Higgins boats right now are being winterized because they're all wood basically. So they're in storage right now. So I can't show you a picture of them, but they were super, super important to an LST because not only was it one way you got supplies and stuff, it's really how you mostly got to land, because there were so many LSTs out there. You're usually not getting a dockage space or a peerage. You usually have to find a different mode of transportation, and that usually end up being the LCVPs. The propeller on the right there, just a unique fun fact for those people that are interested in movies. One of the LCVPs that LST 325 originally had was actually loaned to Clint Eastwood to make Flags of Our Fathers. They actually ended up blowing it up in the movie. But the museum did get the propeller back. So that is actually the propeller from the LCVP that they used in the movie. Now, I want to go through the capabilities kind of an LST and talk about the casualty issues and that sort of stuff. Okay, so I'm making the pitch here. The LST is super versatile, and I think you'll pretty quickly realize that's the case. So you can see a picture there on the left. I kind of already mentioned about just the number of supplies and stuff that they were actually able to hold. But just look at the amount of stuff that is on just different pieces of equipment that's on top of those LSTs. This is in Bagnolia, Italy. This is an advance of Operation Dragoon. And they're just stuffed with material.
In a way, its name as landing ship tank is kind of giving this false idea that it's a tank transporter in the equivalent of like a Diamond T transport of tanks on land that had that one purpose. But
Yep.
This actually is just basically an empty vessel that can take whatever the hell the Army, the Navy, and I guess even the Air Force needs to be taken in volume to the battlefield.
I think it's more appropriately, actually, I kind of refer to this as sometimes it's basically like an assault cargo ship.
Yeah.
Is basically what it ends up being. Now I mentioned I showed you the LST earlier, the LCT being dumped off the LST. There's a good picture of it too, right? Again, just a crazy capability is that they could just put an entire landing craft tank on top of this thing, which is just insane. Fun little aside, by the way, LST 178 there in the front was actually given to the British on this left side picture here. It's actually given to the British, and then it was given to the Egyptians after the war. And then it was actually involved in the Egyptian Operation Musketeer Suez Canal issue with the British. And actually the British ended up blowing US 178 up. I can't remember if it was a Canberra or a variant bomber. But in 1956, it was actually blown up in the middle of the Suez Canal. So we talked about kind of the heavy stuff, but look at the left side here. Later in Normandy invasion, they started using LSTs actually to just transport rail cars. They would weld railroad tracks inside the LST, and they would just go across the English Channel with rail cars. Come to Cherbourg, come to France, come to Rouen. They even went down the rivers in France to Rouen, for instance, and they would just dump these cars straight off of the LSTs. Right? Talk about some serious versatility. I mean, it's quite nuts. We're actually
and
working
not just off the LSTs. When we had Christian Wilmer on last year, rails running up the beaches to railheads. I mean, the transportation of, I forget what his figure was. I'm going to say 350 engines or something like that to the ETO. The incredible. I mean, we completely forget about the rail capability of the US Army in Northwest Europe and how it was all brought across. Extraordinary stuff.
And then I always talk about this, right? One of the main capabilities of the LSTs was casualties. There are a lot of figures thrown around with LSTs because there's so many of them, right? And there's actually some good, they actually have some pretty sufficient information on casualties. But most of the ships that were involved in Operation Neptune Normandy were actually basically deemed casualty transport ships. They were planned to be basically the main casualty lift from shore to shore. So taking them from Normandy back to Southampton, Falmouth, wherever it might have been. In anticipation of that, LST 325 was one of them. In anticipation of that, what they did was they actually added a lot of corpsmen or hospital apprentices on top of that, and also surgical teams to most of the ships. So LST 325, for instance, they got about 20 additional pharmacist mates. There's usually two on the crew. And then they added another five guy surgical team to the ship, just for anticipating a bunch of casualties, basically. And you can see the statistics on the right here. It was used substantially as a casualty lift. And the stories go, if you read the memoirs and how this worked, is, I mean, they were dumping their Duke trucks off. They were dumping whatever they had off onto an LCT on Normandy, D+1, D+2. And as soon as they were doing that, they were accepting casualties right away. That was one of the main things that they did. But you can see just the number of casualties they would take on some of these lifts. I mean, maximum 425. I mean, that's a lot. It was, I forget the exact number, but it was around 230 that they were actually supposed to try to limit the casualty lift to, basically, based on the supplies and stuff they were provided. The other interesting thing that they did a lot of was prisoner transport. So besides picking up casualties, particularly later in the Normandy campaign, they just end up bringing back lots of prisoners. So LST 325 in later June 24th, 25th came back from Utah Beach with almost 800 German prisoners. So just a lot, just filling the tank deck with basically prisoners. And actually on the right side there, that's actually 325. That's in Southampton. I don't know if it's a war for a hard, but that's actually a picture of it from in Southampton. Pretty cool picture.
It is. They're all cool pictures, by the way. We're getting lots of wows in the sidebar, so people are thoroughly enjoying this, as am I.
So one of the really unique things that they did with LSTs was aviation related in two different respects. They actually made a couple of them. I haven't been able to figure out how many they did. There's at least two that I know of that were turned into junior aircraft carriers. And so what they end up doing is they would just end up putting a deck on top of it, and then they would fly Cub planes, L4 Sentinel Cub planes, off the top deck for reconnaissance purposes. And I know for a fact they use this. Maybe somebody knows on the sidebar of shame. Maybe somebody knows of its use in Operation Neptune. I do know they used it in Dragoon. But I'm not aware that they actually used it.
I've not read about it in Neptune, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen, but I don't recall. But yeah, I recall there's a Dragoon story. Yeah.
The other interesting one was the Brody device. And so a number of the LSTs after ETO work, they were transported back to, they drove them back all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States. A handful of them were actually given what they called a Brody system, a Brody device. Here's 393. 393 actually still exists, and it's actually moored in Muskegon, Michigan. It's one of the actual LST museums you can go to in America besides LST 325. But a Brody device is basically they put two kind of crane things on the boat, on the side of it, on the port side, and then you would actually have a plane, and you have a little hook in there. It's kind of like an upside down modern day aircraft carrier catapult or catching system. And you would actually just fly off on the cable, and then you would hook yourself on it on the way back and try to land it. So the concept that we showed before about the junior aircraft carrier, there was no way you didn't land the junior aircraft carrier. You didn't land back onto the LST. This was one way the attempt was going to be to make it to be able to land the actual reconnaissance plane back on the LST. It's a couple of LSTs. They ended up trying this out and actually kind of worked a little bit, but it never, as far as I know, it never actually got any actual wartime experience. Quite a few of the LSTs, including back our old friends, the originals, Boxer, Bruiser, and Thruster.
Yep.
They actually all got turned into fighter direction tenders. A lot of them did. Again, they have a huge cargo hold. And so what they did oftentimes in that huge cargo hold was they put a bunch of communication devices and stuff in there. And then they would just add gantry radars to the top. And this is, so this is actually Her Majesty's LST 216. Most of the fighter direction tenders were Royal Navy operated. A couple other uses. Some of them were turned into ARLs, ARBs, AGPs, or APBs. The name kind of self-describes them. The one that's kind of, I think, really unique and interesting is the APBs, the last one there. The APBs actually, the last LST built in Evansville was an APB. Those were unique. They're used in the Pacific, where there was island stuff, and they would actually just be barracks. And then if you look on the right side there, you can see an example of that. They would have Kiesenut huts or Nissen huts basically on the top and additional living arrangements. And then the tank deck would basically be full of additional places to live. So it basically used to be turned into a humongous barrack that had basically some armament protection and that sort of stuff. So it's kind of an interesting little concept later in the war. Now, the LST is not without its vulnerabilities. Some of you may have heard of the term low slow target. Most of the veterans would call it a large slow target or a low slow target because it was not fast at all. And the problem with it not being very fast and being very, 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 very slow is that it was very vulnerable. I have the numbers here, and I'm popping my spreadsheet real fast, but I have the numbers here. An LST really only went about 12 knots at flank speed, and I think that's really pretty good. That's pretty fast. On the summer cruise, this past summer cruise, the LST right now, I mean, it's going basically 9 miles an hour usually, somewhere in that neighborhood. It's maybe lost a little of its luster since 80 years ago, but they're not fast machines. So that made them really susceptible, and you can see kind of the breakdown there between torpedoes and aircrafts and mines and glider, and there's one glider bomb issue. Three of the aircraft lost actual LSTs were from kamikazes. Now there was other kamikaze hits that just didn't end up terminating or just didn't end up losing the ship. And there was many torpedo hits that, hit and maybe hit the very front of the bow or whatever, and didn't necessarily cause it to be a loss. And so that's why I had the asterisk there, which is these are the ones that are officially what I consider, basically going through all the numbers, what I consider straight up losses based on those events. And really the main problem, I think, with the LST is not that it wasn't armored enough or otherwise. It was carrying a lot of fuel, and it was carrying a lot of fuel right below the deck. So the very, very top deck, weather deck there, down goes about 18 feet down to the tank deck. Right below where the tanks or whatever heavy equipment you're carrying at the time is where all that fuel's at. Okay. So let's say a bomb or a torpedo hit, or say a bomb goes through the top. Well, if there's nothing in it, it's going straight to diesel fuel. And if there's something in it, it's probably a tank or maybe just straight up ammunition that it's carrying at the time. And it's just really flammable stuff. And so fire was a really big problem on these. So when they hit mines, when a torpedo hit, fire was really the really big problem. And one of the biggest disasters, which was kept secret during the war, which is the Westlock disaster. And there's a fairly recent book about this that's really good. Ended up being a congressional investigation and everything, but basically the Westlock disaster happened in May of 1944, and it was right in advance of the invasion of the Marianas Islands. And Westlock is actually an area of Pearl Harbor. So this is they refer to as like the second Pearl Harbor, basically. And what they found out through the investigation was it ended up being just a mortar round exploded when they were basically loading or unloading stuff on the tank deck. It erupted one of the LSTs, which then caused a bunch of other LSTs to get caught on fire and basically blow up. And you can kind of see a picture there on the right side. In total, there were 6 LSTs completely lost as a result of that. On top of that, there were some additional repairs that had to be made to other ones. You can actually see in the picture itself some other LSTs actually kind of really close by, kind of hanging out in the anchorage there. But basically, they were actually planning they were getting ready to go to the Marianas Islands. They had a bunch of Marines on board. And the death toll's there's an asterisk on the death toll because they kept track of the Navy guys, but they didn't keep good track of how many Marines got lost. So it could actually be upwards of like 250 on the actual ultimate loss on that. There's a lot of research, I think, honestly, to be had still with respect to Westlock. But one of the interesting stories from that experience, though, was this Hamburg guy. He was a bosun's mate. He was actually diving later in February of 1945. He was actually diving to basically try to get rid of some of this wreckage, basically, during salvage operations. He actually went and saved another diver that had gotten stuck, and he was going to go try to get somebody else, and he got it basically collapsed on him. He died during it. Interestingly enough, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. It was the last Medal of Honor awarded to anybody in the United States Armed Forces. And interestingly enough, it was the only Medal of Honor ever awarded for a non-combat action, because he was only doing salvage operations at the time. So getting to kind of like what's the legacy of LST, and this is where some questions might be had. My take is it's kind of the quintessential steel, not flesh thing, right? It's just a really practicable ship that was designed, purpose-built for tanks and other heavy equipment, built at the right time, used generally for the right purpose. Steel, not flesh, right? I think there's a great argument to be had. I'd be curious to what you say, Paul, and what others say, but I think there's a good, in my mind, a good pitch that it's probably the most important ship in the Normandy campaign. Certainly not D+1 or D+2 even. I think that gives. I think I would, for landing craft purposes, I would say the LCT. But at least for the Normandy campaign, with just the sheer amount of casualties, kit it brought to the shores of northern France, hands down, in my opinion, probably the most important ship that was out there.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, I always make the point that it's not so much D-Day that's interesting. I mean, it's that race over the next 7 to 10 days to build up the reinforcements. The Germans are bringing up all their tank divisions and stuff, and the Americans and British and Canadians had to bring across their stuff. And yes, the Mulberries were there, but they weren't active, and we lose Mulberry A. Without the LSTs and indeed all the other vessels, it's that I think the Allies wouldn't have won that race. I mean, it was still kind of touch and go, and the storm that occurred a few days after D-Day didn't help. But yeah, I would agree the LST is a fundamental part of the ability for the Allies to bring the big war that James Holland, for example, talks about all the time.
Yeah, and I think Winston Churchill kind of got like he kind of foresaw it, right? He's like, we're waiting on these damn things called LSTs. Maybe not the most glamorous thing, but hey, they got the job done. And I think maybe Ernie Pyle wrote this. Ernie Pyle's a Hoosier, by the way, from Indiana. So that's what a person we call from Indiana is. He grew up, or maybe 2.5 hours north of here. He wrote best, I think, which is maybe this is. It's a good ship, right? Crews like it. Basically gets the job done, but it's not sleek, it's not sexy, and it's not impressively big. So I think he probably says it best personally. Now, interestingly enough, the LSTs were actually used. A number of them were scrapped after the war. A lot of them were transferred to other navies. The United States kept quite a few of them in reserve fleet and ended up using them. Even all the way through Vietnam, some 50 LSTs were used during Vietnam and the rivers of Vietnam. And actually, I've given tours to Vietnam guys that come on and they're bored, and they don't remember what number LST they were on or whatever, but they're like, oh yeah, man, this looks familiar, which is kind of interesting. And one of the other interesting parts is actually becoming kind of newsworthy. If you look on the right side there, 821. It was actually one given eventually to the Philippine Navy. The Philippine Navy actually have it sunk on a shoal, I should say, out in the South China Sea kind of area, Philippine Sea area, in a disputed area of the Chinese. And if you've seen the news articles, you might see references to this sometimes, because the Chinese Coast Guard and them are kind of bashing heads about who actually owns this specific area and stuff right now. But it actually serves as an outpost for Philippine Marines right now. And ties back directly to Evansville. It was built in Evansville Shipyard 80 years ago.
I just wanted to address Sheldrake's point about when you talk about the LSTs in Normandy, is it did mean there were less in Italy. The availability of LSTs drives the Allies switch away from the Italian campaign. More LSTs would have allowed for more landings up the Italian coast. So there's always that Allied concession to, if you put more stuff in one theater or one part, you have to have less stuff elsewhere. But yeah, I would argue that they're pretty plentiful in Normandy, but it does mean that perhaps, yes, the Mediterranean is losing some. They
did lose a lot. So and part of it was and I didn't go into this, and you can read books about this, but we talked about the Trident Conference and that sort of stuff when they first debated this. In December of 43, essentially, they said, hey, we need to start diverting some LSTs to the ETO. Up to that point, if you look at the building records and that sort of stuff, it looks to me pretty much like half we're pretty much going to the Pacific, and then half are going to the ETO. Pacific, they're doing a lot more island hopping, stuff, which makes sense that you're going to have a bunch of LSTs. But they thought they needed more for Normandy, right? And so at some point in time, they actually started diverting a lot of those directly and using those all in the ETO. And so they kind of eventually had to pay the piper too. By the time Normandy got done, a lot of them went back very, very quick, all the way across the Atlantic, through the Panama Canal, straight over to the Pacific Ocean, and started their Pacific Ocean tour. So it's kind of a unique experience, particularly for a lot of the sailors, because they were in Normandy and then they're in Okinawa.
Brilliant stuff. All right.
Now, getting near the end here, one thing I wanted to mention, one of the things some people ask this, they're like, hey, did they have comparables? This is an area I think where a lot of research could probably be done. I think the problem is there's none of these are remaining. The Germans didn't really have one, is the short of it. They had a Marine Fahrprom, which is basically means Navy ferry barge. And but it was more akin to an LCT. It was actually about 150 feet long eventually. Now I think they did use these, for instance, when they were evacuating Sicily, to southern Italy and stuff like that. I think they actually did use these, but there's none around. I saw recently there was a wreckage of one that somebody was diving on, basically, but you can't really find even a good picture of it. So I even just threw the diagram of what I found up because there's just not a good picture of it. So the Germans didn't really have a comparable to an LST. The Japan did. The Imperial Japanese Navy, they had this number 101, type 101. You can see pictures of it right there. It was pretty long. It was pretty long and held quite a few ships, and actually held kind of a comparable number to them. They did not develop them obviously to the extent that the Americans did. And again, the problem is I haven't found a ton of research on those. And the issue is obviously a lot of them were destroyed during the war. They just no longer exist. So, well, I'm happy to take any other questions. That's kind of all I have for today.
Well, it's absolutely brilliant stuff, Alex. And there were a few questions building up. So Sheldrake commented right at the beginning. He said, I've heard what may be an apocryphal story that Churchill tracked the location of every LST in the Western theatre, so vital were they to the war effort. Did Alex discover this in his research?
No, I have not seen that he tracked it to that extent.
Oh, that's a pity. But that good. Roderick asked, are the bow doors hydraulic?
Yeah, they're actually electric.
Electric.
Yes, actually, in later models, one of the changes they did add. Some of the later models might have turned into hydraulics. I'll have to double check on that. All the early model stuff was there was not a hydraulic on board. It was almost all electric. And so I didn't show you pictures of it. There's actually 3 DC generators on board. Each have their own additional diesel engine on them. And so everything was electric. We talked about the ventilation fans, the winches, all of that is electric at the time.
Okay. Another couple of questions. So this is a very specific one, but maybe you'll know the answer. John said, were the sub-chasers given to the Norwegians for the Shetland bus carried over in LSTs? I know they weren't sailed over.
Ooh, that's a good question.
It's one of those ones that either you would know that or you wouldn't. It's not.
I don't know. Yeah. That's a very specific question, John. But I would say I have seen some chasers on top of an LST before. Whether that was that specific time, I have no idea.
Okay. This is an interesting one from Samuel. Were there experiments with wet decks for LSTs? Open the doors and float out your Higgins boats, ducks, and so on?
Nope. There was just not. And part of it had to be, I think, probably just would they have gotten there if they had plenty of time to plan this and all that sort of stuff? Yeah, they probably would have, because you look at the LST equivalent in modern day terms, in modern marine terms, and we have amphibious boats that do just that.
Okay.
They half sink themselves and they float the boat within the vessel itself.
I feel Samuel's trolling me this time now. Is it true that Churchill worked out the Sword Beach landing with toy LSTs in his bath while drinking scotch? Now, we know that Churchill did play warships in his bathtub. I remember he even carved them out of soap, if I remember correctly. And he would and the story, I think it was Andrew Roberts, I'll let you give your response. Andrew Roberts, I think, told me this years ago, is that when he was playing warships, and if you haven't heard this one, folks, you're in for a doozy. He had a particular way of doing sound effects for torpedo, and he would have someone who would often run his bath for a member of staff, a butler, and if he was about to fire a torpedo, he would call the butler in and then go torpedo loss, fart under the water, and that would be his sound effect. And he didn't just do this once or twice, he did multiple times, and every time the butler, like John Gielgud in Arthur, would have to do it. Oh, very good, sir. Yes, oh, very droll. It was funny last time, it was funny the time before that. But do you have a response to the Churchill playing with LST?
No, I have not heard that he made a toy LST.
Brilliant stuff. Well, and then this is a really interesting one. Two actually interesting ones. One from Kevin. Did any of your relatives work in the LST shipyards in Evansville, Indiana, or rather through the volunteer work you do there? You obviously had people who were crews of the LSTs coming through and descendants. But what about the people who made them? Have you had people who've come through who were on the manufacturing side?
Yep. yeah, I'm actually not from this area, so I don't have any particular relatives that work down here. But on tours all the time, we have people that have relatives, and we have a map of the shipyard actually in the museum that shows kind of wherever it was. Because sometimes they'll be like, "Hey, I remember he was an electrician that worked, or whatever." And I was like, "Hey, look, I can show you right where that is at."
Wow.
The shipyard's actually just down from where the museum is actually. So I actually can kind of point roughly to where some of that stuff is. So that's kind of a unique experience. And I would say too that what we have a lot of too in Evansville, particularly is Evansville made the second most. It made over 6,200 P-47 Thunderbolts.
Right.
And so we have a lot of people that just have a lot of relatives that I think are just generally interested in World War II stuff, because they have a lot of experiences with their relatives doing work. And one of the things, we had a lot of Rosie Riveters and that sort of stuff, and some of the contracts that were given. A lot of 45 caliber, like 96% or something like that of the 45 caliber, which is basically the handgun caliber, was made here. And almost 75% of that was women. So we have a lot of interesting stories that we hear about a lot of that stuff, because we're just kind of one generation kind of off of that generally now.
And we talked before going live just how many people have an LST connection, and you talked about how big the kind of the association was in the post-war years, and that's kind of been reflected by the sidebar, the number of people that have said, oh, relative who was on, and not just necessarily just LSTs, but LSTs, LCIs, LCTs, what have you. We have another question, then we will bring things to an end. And Laura is saying, my father-in-law was on LST in the Pacific. Did any LSTs carry parts of the atomic bomb project at Tinian?
Not aware of it.
No, I didn't think that was possible. Obviously, they are part of the general infrastructure of getting stuff towards Japan, the whole pushing of the airfields closer and closer to Japan. So they're part of that massive, great taking of the war to Japan.
Yeah, and I would add one of the things LST 325 actually did on one of its ventures back from Normandy was actually it had a couple, 3 or 4 Navy specialists. And they actually brought back German mines to inspect.
Right.
So that's kind of that, the kind of getting into a weird little confidential area. And 325 also too, after the war, and maybe this is a good time to talk about this. If you go to the website, if you have a chance, lstmemorial.org, check it out. There's a really good documentary about it, about how it got back over from the Greek Navy. Basically, the Greek Navy got it from us. They gave it back to us for free, and there's a whole cool story about the guys that did that. Average age of the crew was 72 at the time that they brought it back. There's a cool History Channel documentary about it. Highly suggest you watching it. But after the war, between that time period, it was actually used for DU-line operations and radar installations in the Arctic Circle, and so it was doing pretty confidential, highly confidential stuff, putting radar installations up because we were worried about China and Russia. Yeah. So it was installing this stuff in the middle of nowhere.
Well, brilliant. Well, my last question, and it's from me, is as a volunteer, then you're obviously one of several who do that. Is there a single question that is the most asked by visitors, or misconception or myth? I mean, it's, as a Normandy guy, there are certain things that all the groups ask, and you kind of roll your eyes you're not bothered by it, but there are certain regular questions. Is there a particular one that you get it every single time?
It's a good one. Do I get one every time? Frankly, a lot of them are, what's LST stand for? Right. That's asked dang near every time. Most people don't quite understand exactly how that worked. But no, I think, I don't think so. There's nothing. I don't think nothing comes to my mind. There's a lot of people have a lot of actually different things that they're interested in. Yeah. And so I've noticed, for instance, a lot of women like going to the mess area, like the kitchen area, and just seeing what that will look like. And so I have stories about coffee. Coffee's, it's a 24/7 operation, right? So coffee's flowing all the time. They always like that kind of stuff. Some of the guys obviously really like getting on the gun. We actually allow them to get on the Bofors, and you can actually turn the handle and that sort of stuff. They actually really like doing that, like little children, like little Winstons.
I mean, if I was there, my takeaway would be, when your earlier photos is how in a sense, modern and slick the system was. I mean, I regularly go back and forth between the UK and France on the ferry, and the photos you showed pretty much look like the ferry I take in 2025, and the fact it has traffic lights and that management and the system there. Because I suppose, without really thinking about it, I've not read extensively about the LST. I think of it as a bit more primitive, isn't the right word, but kind of functional. So but actually really quite sophisticated. You said, you explained about the elevators and the ramps and the systems they were getting off there, because ultimately it was only going to work if the system for unloading and loading was efficient. It's all very well cramming stuff onto something, but it's the getting off that is the vital thing. As you said there about the Neptune and plan, is that it's part of a system that works. When you start adding the LST to the things like the Red Ball Express, we talked about the railways, we talked about this, you understand just really how good the Allies were at moving shitloads of stuff across massive distances in shitload quantities. I mean, they really were very good at it.
And you actually kind of foresaw the other operating LST in the United States to this day. It's not in World War II configuration. Is the LST 510. It's actually a ferry between Long Island and Connecticut.
Yeah, someone mentioned that earlier. Yeah, I mean, it's like the ducks that still do the tours and things around the world. It's amazing. But anyway, we will end things there. Folks, next week is a real kind of a broad sweep of shows. I'm particularly looking to Mondays. Rachel Lance is coming back, talking about the science of blast studies and explosions and how they work and brain trauma and things like that, which is going to be a fantastic topic. We've got other subjects. We're talking about Greece in 1941. We've got How to Be a Historian with Erin Faith Allen, and we are talking about intoxicating pleasures and how alcohol, the US attitudes to alcohol changed during World War II. So some really brilliant subjects coming your way. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, viewers, for your subjects. Don't forget, everybody, click like and subscribe, buy my guest books, go to their websites, go to the LST website that's in the description below and learn more about it. But I will see you all next Monday. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Bye.